welcome our next speaker and Doug committee member, Bryan Hack. Today he will be presenting his session, Leveraging Workflow Throughout GP. Please stick around after Bryan's session for a live Q&A.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Bryan. Nice to virtually meet all of you. I think I've got the audio going, the camera going, and the screen going. So 3 for 3 so far. All right. So let's get this piece here. So what we're going to talk about today is leveraging workflow throughout GP. So try and do in the day of life scenario, and hopefully give you some insights and some tips as well into how to use the procurement features, leveraging workflow to streamline your day and some processes. So first off, my name is Bryan Hack, a CPA CMA. I'm the principal at the BHC Group. I reside in Winnipeg, Manitoba, from Vancouver, BC. And prior to that, born and raised in Durban, South Africa. But came when I was young, so lost the accent in the school system somewhere. In 2002, I started working with Dynamics GP, and I worked for 10 years for 2 different Microsoft partners within the Vancouver area. And I was traveling across Canada to small towns, mostly to mining companies, forestry mills, working with wholesalers, distributors, not-for-profits, sort of seen a lot of different industries in my career over those 10 years of implementing GP solely. And then after 10 years and wrapping up a very large project that was just my full-time project, I decided it was time for a change and joined a startup company in 2012, essentially doing management consulting and doing independent product agnostic software selection, focusing on ERP systems to start. So the idea was to take my 10 years of implementing and help sell and manage ERP systems and working for the end customer, looking to select new systems and then implement those ERP systems. So I did that for 4 years, got a lot of good experience, still kept getting pulled back into the GP world with some customers who followed me from partner A to partner B to new company C, and decided it was time to go back to the GP world. And at the same time, too, kind of focus on helping companies leverage the tools and technology they own. So how do we take GP to the next level? How do we get them upgraded? How do we get new features and functions working for them? And then if we decided at that point it wasn't, or they wanted software selection of a new ERP or a financial planning and analysis tool or maintenance management systems or HR and payroll, we would do the software selection, and I would use those skills and tools I learned for the 4 years prior with under the new banner. So that's kind of what led us to today, 8 years plus as the BHC Group. And in 2023, I attended the DynamicsCon live event in Scottsdale, Arizona. So that was a big eye opener for me. Super happy to be involved. See what's going on. And that led me to join the Dynamics User Group Mentorship Committee later in the year. So there was a call for mentors. So I thought I was signing up to be a mentor, but ended up signing up to help create the program. So that was a different experience, but a lot of fun. And we're still working today with the same group. We do meetups, and we've got mentors and mentees. And we're just trying to keep things going and helping out both mentors and mentees throughout the program. And then earlier this year, I spoke at the DynamicsCon Live 2024 event in Denver, Colorado. That was another great experience. Very happy to be there, connect with people who I met the year before, connect with partners, connect with customers. Really good experience, and that's led me to speak today. And I will be putting in my bid to speak at DynamicsCon 2025 in Chicago next year. So excited for that. And I'm happy and excited to be here, and let's kind of move through what we're going to talk about. All right, so from the agenda perspective, I'm going to talk about some prerequisite setup requirements. I'm going to talk about some of the workflow maintenance and show you screens on what's required, what do we use, how does it all work. Then we'll set the stage with some scenarios. Then we're going to walk through those scenarios, and then I'm going to cover some tips and tricks. And then questions. Again, I've got the chat open on another device so I can look for incoming questions, and then contact information. And then I believe at the end, we'll have an open Q&A session as well. All right, so from the prerequisite side, so workflow setup. So that's a window under the system or administration system workflow setup. And in here, there's a couple sections that we have to look at. So the first part is about enabling email for workflow. So you got to turn that on, that checkbox, which is that top section, and then that allows the workflow to flow through email. So you've got to set up your SMTP information. So I would talk with the IT department, make sure they've got the information, they set that up for you. And then you would need that basic authentication down below. And now what's going to happen there is anytime there's an escalation point or someone goes to approve or reject a transaction, when they click on that link, it's going to use this authentication to send the information. Okay, there's also a reminders feature with the workflow that we'll talk about later. And if that reminder automatically triggers, it uses this authentication and this email address to inform the appropriate person. For the second part, that's more down here under the enable email actions part. That information is the web server. So that needs to be set up in advance. Again, talk to IT. They should be able to set that up. And then what this allows you to do is when an email is sent, it's going to provide the hyperlinks for approve or reject or potentially delegate in the body of the email. And then when you select that, one of those three options, it's going to open a web browser where the approver can then approve it externally to GP through the web. And that's going to then trigger the notifications. So this needs to be set as well in order to do that. And then there's an option down here which says this server requires a secure connection. That just makes it more secure. Again, if that's going to be turned on, just work with IT to make sure that component's ready to go. Okay. The nice part is by doing this and using the web services component, users don't have to sign into GP to approve, meaning they don't have to be a GP user at all. This uses Windows Active Directory. And so that's kind of where we would set up inside of GP. You would pick those users that are not GP users, but you get access to the directory. Again, you have to work with IT to make sure they're on the right domain and they have the right access. But for the most part, once set up, it can work relatively smoothly. Okay. So next is the document attachment setup. So in here, if you want to attach documents and have them flow through the workflow engine, you need to set it up. And so first things first, you need to mark allow document attachments. That's the first thing. Then you need to pick a specific location where those documents will be stored. And they're stored in the database as a blob type. And then down here, we have other options. If you want to delete or attachments or add them to inquiry windows, you can have passwords in there. And at the same time, down here, how do I want these documents to flow from different windows, whether it's the customers, the items, the vendors, or from the payroll side. And then at the very end, you want to mark the send attachments in email. So that way it comes as an attachment in the email when the approver receives it. Okay, so nothing too complex here. Usually this is set up in advance anyway. The only thing that might be different is send attachments in email. Company email setup. So this is one of those things where it can get a little complicated. Again, you got to work with IT, but there's this, the Modern Authentication is what needs to be set up. So that's done on Azure. There's a lot of blogs and links out there. If you were to Google Modern Authentication for Dynamics GP, I'm sure you would hit one right off the bat. And so your IT team would go in there, they would register the Modern Authentication, they would provide you a key or a code, and then you would come in here, or they would do it, and they would paste that value into the application ID. Note there is a web client authentication code. So if you have the web client for users as well as local clients, those might be two different IDs and would need a second setup. Okay. Once you hit OK after you put in the keys, you might get now the multi-factor authentication prompt. So it's going to ask for your email, then your password, and then it might set up the multi-factor, which will go onto your device as the Microsoft Authenticator app, or sometimes it can be set, I believe, as a text or a call option as well. All right, next one, probably the last one we'll talk about now, is the workflow calendar setup. So when you're setting up the workflow, you can have a timed event. Okay, so I can submit, say, a vendor creation approval off, and I'm going to set that the time limit is 8 hours, or 10 hours, or 24 hours, or 48 hours. Each user and each client is different in how they want the timing to go, and it can be different for every different series and different option and different workflow step. But where they kind of come together is through this workflow calendar. So if you're activating the calendar, which is optional on when you set up the workflow, and we'll look at that later as well, I'll highlight it, you can tell it to use the workflow calendar or not. And if you use the workflow calendar, then it's going to want you to have your start and end times, as well as the days that users work. So whether it's 7 days a week or only 5 days a week, 8 a.m. to 5, it could be 9 to 6, whatever it is, the workflow calendar is going to take that into account. So for example, if it's 4 o'clock on a Friday and the workflow calendar says the approver has 8 hours to approve it, and it's 4 o'clock Saturday or 4 o'clock Friday, right? And I hit submit and I'm using the workflow calendar, this is only going to be due at, say, 3 o'clock on Monday, because it's going to take 1 hour from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. And then it's go from 8 on Monday to 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way to 3, which is your 8-hour block. If we don't use the workflow calendar, that 4 p.m. on Friday is due by 12 a.m. Saturday. So again, depending on timing and how often and realistic you want your approvals and your reminders, because the reminders follow this as well, you'll want to set up this calendar appropriately. Okay, so usually at this point I would break for questions. I'm going to just take a quick look at the chat, see if there's anything here. If not, I'll keep going, and then I understand there's that open Q&A at the end. Okay, so far no questions in the chat, so I'm just going to keep going. So workflow maintenance. So now we're going to get into a couple of the workflow setups. So we've got in the workflow options, the purchasing module, the financial module, sales, payroll, and administration. Okay, so those are sort of the 5 areas that you can have to set up workflows. And we'll kind of go into those and see what options are available to set up within there. The ones I'm going to be deep diving in today and showing on the screen are going to be related to the purchasing module. And we're going to focus on vendors, requisitions, and purchase orders. So for example, here's a vendor approval example. But before I get into that, we'll just take a look here. So when you're in your workflow maintenance setup window, you would pick this little button down here and pick your series. So I'm under purchasing. So the options where I can do the setups and set workflows, I was on payables batches and then payables transactions. So again, if you've got lots of payables and you do it one at a time, there's a lot of emails flowing, but you can also run it through a batch. And then purchase order approvals, which we'll look at later, purchase requisitions, which we'll look at later, purchasing invoices, which again is another option we won't look at, receiving, and then vendor approval. Okay, so if I were to go into my vendor approval, I expand on this, I come down here, I can see I've got a workflow set up called AP vendor approval, and I have a step called vendor approval. Okay, and then over here, you can insert a manager. So for each of these different levels, you can insert a manager, and that manager is someone that can have sort of overall control. If the approver is not away or they want to get delegated to the manager, they could approve. And in addition, there's hierarchical routing approval. So you don't have to pick one person. You can just say, go to the manager. That would then route to this person or persons in here. You can have multiple people as managers. So when we look at the AP vendor approval, this is sort of the main grid section as you start. We give it a name and a description. And then down here, this is one that's created. So we're just reviewing this one. It's for the vendor approval and it's always running. Okay, so it's not a condition, it's an always run rule. And it's assigned to the Great Plains administrator, which is me for now. So down here, we've got different options and these can be turned on and off as needed, but send notifications for completed actions. So I'll go into this window in a minute. Allow approver to delegate their task. So you can turn that on or off. Allow an originator to be an approver. So really, are you allowed to approve your own? Yes or no. Always require at least one approver. So you can have that as an option. Use an alternate final approver. So if someone's away or you want someone else to approve it, you can turn that on. Or omit no action needed and do nothing. The second section down here is related to when a task is overdue. So do nothing, take no action, escalate it to the next approver in the list, and we'll look at a cascading list later of approvers, or just automatically reject it, or I should say escalate it to one particular person so that it doesn't get lost. Okay. So now what I would do is I would click on this send notification for completed actions. This is a great window in here because what this allows you to do is it's going to notify the originator. So the person creating the vendor and hitting submit, they're going to get notified on any of these actions. So once it's submitted, they're going to get notified that they've submitted something. If they recall it, they would get notified that they've recalled it. And if they resubmit, they'll get notified they've resubmitted it. In here, they can mark or notify that it's approved or that the task is completed, that the approver has delegated it to somebody else, that it was escalated through that no action escalation, or somebody edited their transaction, or in this case, the vendor, or that it was final approved. So again, in this case, we had these ones selected. The final approve is always a good one because if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 approvers in the process, you would get an email after every approval, but then really you're also looking for the final approval. So I would say this is the main one to have. The reject would be a main one to have, and then maybe an escalate or an approve on the original might be a good one to have. But in the case of my test environment, this was what was created. So now when I go into the next part of the vendor approval setup, I'm saying that this action is always required. So it's not conditional, it's always required in this case. And it's assigned to the Great Plains administrator. Now this can be assigned to multiple people, and we'll look at that later. And then there's a completion policy before I get into the rest of this that says only one of the approvers need to respond, or the majority must approve, or all of them must approve, or just a specific number. So if you have 2 approvers, 3 approvers, 4 approvers, some of these different policies might make more sense for what you're required. But for now, it's just going to the Great Plains administrator, and I've got a time limit of 48 hours to approve. And remember, I commented on that apply workflow calendar, so that's where I turn this on. So my 48 hours is between 8 and 5, Monday to Friday. Okay, and I'm going to get an email reminder every 4 hours that I have something to approve. Now that may be a bit much out of a 48-hour period, but again, each company may set or do this at their own time. As far as sending a message, I would want to turn that on. So yes, turn that on. And there's a default message ID, and I'll show you what that looks like and how you can edit that and create your own. And then we want to include the document attach documents function. So as I showed before, we need to activate it in the attachments window and then have a file for it to save. And now we're telling it to include those document attachment documents through that approval policy. So this is an example of what that message ID would look like. It's a combination of hard-coded values or text, as well as codes or fields. And when you get into the message ID, if I just go back a slide, that would be the send message. I could click on that, or I can go into it through the front end of GP through the navigation, into message IDs, and I can select the options in here, or I can create my own. Or I click on that and I can type in any other information. I can also add additional fields. And then once you're done, you would save that and then make sure you update it if it's new. And then that's what's this information is what will go to the approver. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at under requisitions approval. So purchase requisitions. So this one is similar to the vendor. It's just going to go to the buyer in this case. And I'll talk about this one quicker. But you can see here, I've created that this goes to the buyer. And the step is the buyer is always running and it's assigned to Laura. Same thing, I've got options that I can turn on or off. And then inside of my actions, again, I can turn those on or off. That's for the approve, the reject, the delegate, the final approve, and so on. And in this case, when there's a task overdue, I'm just going to take no action. So going back into the buyer step, I've said in this case for the condition, it's always required. Okay, I'm not putting in a condition. It's going to Laura. She has 8 hours. I'm using the workflow calendar, so Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. She's going to get a reminder every 4 hours. And I've said yes to including the document attachments as well as sending her the email message. The third one that we'll talk about now is the purchase order approval. So this is where it gets a little bit more detailed. So notice here, I've got PO workflow version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So a couple reasons for this. The client that I'm working with in this case for my sample is a mining company. And they're every time they're going through their growth stage, they're adjusting their purchase order policy and they're adding more staff. So we've set this up in a way that every time there's a major change, so either adding new users or approvers, I should say, or changing the structure of the workflow, what we end up doing is using the copy feature, which I'll talk about later, and copying it as a new version and then updating the new version and doing testing. And then once that's done, converting it into production. And I'll again talk to you about how to do that the most effectively as well later. So while that I've got that and I expanded on that V9, and notice there's a green check mark next to it. So that means it's active and you can only have one active workflow. Now here's sort of that cascading menu or that drill down tree view of what's happening. So the first step is it's always required. So their rule is it always goes to the manager responsible for procurement. It's an operations site person. They're responsible for anything coming into site. So they have to be aware. And once they approve, then it routes based on a department. So in here, we can see I've got level 1 inventory, level 3 inventory, and I'll talk about that later. And then for their maintenance and their mill operations and mining and underground, they've got level 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And why we've done it this way is just playing around with the workflow and making sure the proper approvers are being routed to. It can get tricky on identifying the routing. So I've noticed that, yeah, maybe a couple extra steps, but this way it always runs down and inside and then back down and inside. So I know the right person is getting the right approval at the right time. We've had a few instances where if we said, well, level 3 maintenance is always the CFO and it's the same person on every one, you could drop that down and indent it. So we'd run through the list and then go back to that person. But again, we've had issues where it doesn't always do what it's supposed to. And they were complaining, so we built it out this way. Wasn't much extra effort, but it seems to work well and no complaints ever since. So when I mentioned this was routed by department, on the purchase order entry window, as you know, there's no field necessarily called department. So what we've done is we try to be creative and we're using the buyers table. Okay, so they have 1 or 2 buyers and it's not that important for them to track in the table. So they're using the departments within that table. So down here, we've got administration, community relations, environment, exploration, geology, and so on. So what's nice here is this is a set list. It's not, someone's not going to change it or spell something wrong. It's secured. Only certain people have access to maintain this list. So it's really nice from that perspective, and it's an easy field to route any of the approvals based on the buyer versus trying to get into a department based on a GL account segment. We can do it, but those get a lot more complicated, where this was a much easier way to route for approval. So the way that this one works is this is sort of the main view or a summary view of it. But you can see here that it's running more in like a list versus an indented view. So I showed both. And this is sort of that summary view. So we're always running, goes to this person. Then if it's inventory, it goes to this person. So it's the manager of that department. So the maintenance manager, the mill ops manager, the mining manager. In some cases, they're the same, but we did that on purpose because they're just temporarily taking on that role. And as the mine expands and more people come in, it's much easier to just swap out, say, Sam for Mike if we needed to. So level 1 are certain dollar approval values, which are the managers. Then level 2 are the directors, and there's 2 directors. One of the 2 need to approve. And then level 3 is the CFO. Okay, so the trick is making sure that the routes are working and going to the right people when based on these certain conditions. Okay, so now when I go into the purchase order approval example, let's go into level 1. So we're just drilling down a bit onto that level 1 for maintenance. And I can see now that this action is only required when the following condition is met, where the PO work buyer ID is maintenance. Okay, so this is following the always required step. That's how I get it indented into that tree as you adjust this follow step. And now it's where it's maintenance. The next level 2 is maintenance and over $2,000. So here the buyer ID is maintenance, and I'll show you the condition editor later. The purchase order subtotal, so not including taxes, shipping, freight, those type of things, is greater than and equals to $2,000. Meaning the manager has approval up to $1,999.99. So if it's under 2,000, this workflow happens once at this level, and then it's complete. If it's over 2, this person has to approve, then this person will get notified to approve as well. So this will be the third approval, on that purchase order. Okay. Excuse me. Level 3. So this goes to the maintenance person, which is the CFO, if it's over $50,000. So the director has between $2,000 and $50,000 to approve. And so the reason why the inventory one didn't have a level 2 is because a lot of the inventory is more than $2,000. So they just went straight to level 3. So in this case, we've got level 1, 2, and 3, and this is following level 2 step, hence the indentation on that previous screen. So this is the workflow condition editor. So when you're back at one of these windows, there would be just down there a little gray arrow that you would click that would take you into here. So this is for that third one where maintenance is over 50,000. You've got your sort of option box here where I can drop down and select or. So it can be an and or an or function. And then you click this drop down and you would scroll through the lists and find the field that you want to base the routing on. It can be based on vendor, it can be based on dates, it can be based on dollar amounts. There's all sorts of fields that you can select. And if you display extended list of fields, you get even more. And so you would select your criteria, click add, it would go on the list. If you want to do a secondary criteria, click add, and just keep building that conditional logic as needed. So next, the sales side. So we're not going to get into too much more details here, but this is just a highlight of what the options are inside of the financial series. So the general ledger account. So I really like putting one on here, really good from an audit perspective. And if you have accountants that want to create new accounts, but have, say, the controller or VP finance approve it to make sure it's in the right sequence so your financial reports and other reporting functions are working as expected. That's a really good approval one. And oftentimes too, I've been asked by auditors and companies at the end of the year, show me a listing of all the new accounts added. I could also refer to this and look at information to see who approved the creation of those accounts. And you've got the general ledger batch approval as well. So you've got the standard GP batch approvals set up in the posting setup of GP. So you can activate that where someone has to go in and put a password. So the downside is they have to go into GP, know the password. Where this side is, if you put this on, they don't have to be a GP user. It can be done externally through an approval link or just as an informational component if they just accept it. So another nice option there if you've got GL batch approvals. On the sales side, so we only have two options right now, the receivables batches and the sales transactions. So those are the options there. Hopefully customers might come one day, but I haven't seen that yet. And to be honest, I haven't looked at 18.7's release to see if the customers are in there, but I'll make sure to do that. Payroll, so this is US payroll, okay, not Canadian. So again, if you've got employees, profile skills, and this might apply to the US customers of GP, but up in Canada, this doesn't really help me much with my customers. And lastly, the administration series. So this is also a really good one. I like this because if someone edits a security role that had been set up in the beginning, you've got to route it through approval. So oftentimes if people get a bit tricky or sneaky and they have the access to do it, sometimes people go in, make changes, but then it's not tracked. And now that can affect multiple people, not just one, if it's not done correctly. And I think from an audit perspective, this is a good one to know. Because again, I've been asked what's the security changes throughout the year from the auditors, and this is one nice way to go as well. So that's the security roles, which hold all those tasks. And then you go to the task level, which hold all the windows and reports and forms and other things. And then you've got the smart list designer approval, user approval, and user security. So again, these two are really good because if you've got new users being created, you could have someone to sign off on it. And if you're adjusting their security, you can turn this on. And now again, that's tracked knowing that a security change was done on that user. Okay. Again, I would pause for questions. Let me just take a look. And so far, I think we're okay on the chat. All right, so let's keep going. So let's set the stage for a couple of the walkthroughs. So this walkthrough we're going to do follows the vendor approval and the purchase order. Okay, so we'll start with vendors. So in GP, you would go into the vendor maintenance card. So purchasing cards, vendor maintenance, and go and create your vendor. Okay, so once you've created the vendor, what you would see is now that so I should caveat that, you need to activate the vendor workflow first. Okay, so once it's activated, now you're going to get this ribbon that's going to sit atop of the window. Once you've performed the task, you would click workflow and then hit submit. Sort of my screenshot slightly a bit out of order, but if you wanted to attach a document, so go back to your vendor, click this little double arrow, attach a document that might be why you're adding them as a vendor. Maybe it's a credit report, maybe it's a contract letter or an employment letter, and these are for their expenses. Any information that I think you put on the record going for approval makes the approval easier because then your manager or director doesn't have to ask for more information later. So what you would do is then come in, once you select that submit, you would have an option to put in a comment. Again, you could say, purchasing this because we need new equipment and this vendor is new or whatever the case may be. So then you hit submit, and that's going to send the email off to the approver. They're going to get an email saying you have a new email for approval, and we'll look at what that looks like down the road a little later in the presentation. If I go back and type in the vendor ID again of BHC Group here, now I've got a status bar telling me that the vendor is pending approval by the Great Plains Administrator, and there's the due date in time. Okay. So now coming in as the approver through Great Plains of GP, I would go in and just hit workflow and then approve, reject, or delegate. If you have a manager status, you can do this for anybody. It doesn't have to be the actual approver. You have the override ability, but note that down the road, we'll look at in the presentation that there's a workflow history, and it will tag you as the person that approved it, not the original manager. It's not a approval on their behalf. It's you're approving it and your name is tagged to it. So then you would hit approve or reject. I strongly suggest if you reject it to put a comment why you're rejecting it. In this case, I approved it, so I hit approve. And then if I go back into the window just to see it, I look up the vendor again. Now I can see that it was approved. And again, if you're looking at any historical vendor or vendor that was approved 6 months ago, 2 years ago, you could come in here and actually see what their approval date was. Excuse me. So here's the workflow history. So anytime you're in the workflow windows, there's a banner and it's going to say workflow history. And if you click on that, now you're going to see any of those processes that followed for that vendor. So it was originated by the administrator. They submitted it this date and time. It was pending at this date and time. It was overdue or it was approved and so on. So this is a really neat window to track what was done against that vendor and what the times were like. So as I mentioned before, we're going to go back and look at the email approval. So as an approver, this is what as an example of an email I would see. So it's to the Great Plains administrator telling me that I've got a task assigned for vendor step. There's the vendor information. If there was an attachment, it would be attached to the document. And then I would hit approve, reject, or delegate, and that's going to open up the web service where you would sign in if you're in the office and go from there and approve, reject, or delegate. And we'll look at what those windows look like shortly. So now if we go under the purchase order scenario, we've got purchase order pending approval. So here, I'm looking at all my POs pending approval like slightly differently than going PO by PO or looking at just the emails. So in GP, and this works for vendors too, I'm going into the navigation list. Again, sometimes this is new for people. Excuse me. So normally you default to purchasing, which is that homepage for purchasing. But if you go and click these down arrows, now it's opening up a different level of information with the workflow. So I would click on this, and then here would be a list of all the pending POs. And again, if you had requisitions, you click that button, you would see a list of all the pending requisitions, all the pending vendors, and so on. And what's nice here is you can blanket approve. So if you recall this window, if you click on any one of these lines, it usually at the bottom changes the lines of the PO or the rec that you're looking at. So users could review it in here at a high level and say, yeah, that's right. Or wow, that's high. Let me click on it, see the lines without having to open the PO. Then they can say, yeah, these two are ready for approval, and they just multi-select. So I click one, click two. There we go, click one, click two. And now I've got sort of the approve or reject or delegate function for both of those documents. So from here, if I just go hit approve, it's going to approve both and send the emails back to the originator saying that was approved, assuming that was marked in their notification box. So here's an example of the email for the purchase order that went to the approver. So when we looked at the vendor, it's just, vendor information. There's not a lot of detail. But when you look at the PO and you include the lines, including any job. So in this case, we're using Wensoft job costing. We have the job number that we put in here. So that shows as well, which is quite nice. So there's an example of the attachment that came through. I've got approve or reject. I didn't turn on the delegate for this purpose. There's the vendor, there's the subtotal. Those are the lines that are being purchased. And then if we notice down here, there's all those comments. So remember when I originated the requisition, there was a comment. Then when it was approved, there's a comment. If it's a recall, you have the comment. So all of those comments get tracked in the email and just append through the next set of emails. So now if I go and click approve or reject, this is going to load up the web services component. So again, this needs to be configured in advance. Users need to know their Active Directory, username and password, which should know that. It's usually pretty straightforward on how they sign into their machine. So assuming everything's good there and there's no conflicts with different domains and there's nothing, too crazy going on, it should be straightforward to load up. You're going to get this type of window pop up. Okay, so it's pointing to the web service portal. In here, it's telling me for this document, because I hit the approve hyperlink, I can put in comments and hit approve. And once I do that, then I'll get a notice saying this approval has been initiated or submitted, and off you go. All right, so I think that was it for the questions. Let's make a note here or just check the chat. It's just cycling through. But let's keep going. We got a few more minutes here. So tips and tricks. We've got about 10 minutes and then we're gonna pause for the QA. Approval on the phones is the next one. So yes, you can do it. We've done it, but it's tricky. You either need a VPN on the phone because it has to connect through that web service, or if you don't have a VPN, you need to open a port, which again can open up your risk for security concerns, and again, work with IT on that. Regardless of how you do it, if you're gonna do it, you need to use the Microsoft Outlook app for on the device, and not, say, on the iPhone, just the Mail app. That strips out a few things. It's the Outlook app that's key. Workflow user delegation. So let's say you're going on vacation or you're sick or you have a holiday coming up. On the user's homepage, a user can go in and go to their user preferences. And then in their preferences, they can go down to this workflow delegation button. And then in here, they can delegate their workflow to somebody and have the start and end dates. So if they forget to do it, then an administrator or someone who has access can come in here and delegate a task for somebody and set their start and end date. The copy workflow function, super good. I use it all the time. So when I'm setting up a new workflow, I'll go into the test company. Hopefully you have a test company as well for testing things like this. I set it up, I do all my testing. Once I know it's good, then I can come back in, select the workflow that's working for me, click the copy button, and then I can give it a name, and I can tell it the company I want to copy it to. So you click that drop down, you'll see a list of the companies if you have multiple, and you can copy that workflow to your live or production company. Exporting workflow. So same thing in here, I select it and I can click export. Where this is useful is if you have, say, a test environment, so a completely separate environment for other purposes. You can do your testing in there, you can set it up. Once you like it, you can export it, copy this JSON file from one server to the other, and then use the import function to import it into your production company and or your test company as well. It's very easy to import into both. As consultants, if you want to set up a workflow and take it with you from company to company, you could probably do that as well. Just would have to update things after the import. Assuming it imported successfully, then you would just make the updates after. So yeah, workflow exported successfully. Click on the import function, pick the name, and off it goes. From the organizational structures perspective, excuse me. So this is a fun one too for setting up security. Let's say you have multiple departments, or in this case, they have a site, so a corporate office and a site office. You can set restrictions in the accounts by a segment of the GL that then limits users from their lookups. So when you're entering requisitions or purchase orders, you're really limiting their lookup on the account, so they can't see or can't code to accounts they don't have access to. And then over here, merging multiple recs to POs. Again, this is using the navigation list function where I've got requisitions. I've created 3 different requisitions. I'm tagging all 3, and I'm going to create 1 PO or 2 POs based on a vendor and a delivery date or a address ID for shipping, those kind of things. Once I go through this process and I hit purchase, it's going to email that PO or those POs off to the associated approvers or the respective approvers. The nice thing is in here, what we did is we used the GP web client for this company, and we had about 20 limited users, which is a much cheaper license cost. It's like $175 or $200 a license, and let them create the recs, which are then route to the buyer to approve and then take that across. So the requisitions routing rule was go to the buyer, and then the PO routing rule would go to the respective managers, directors, and the CFO. So moving through here, when I'm combining these POs, it's going to come to a preview window where I can make updates and changes. Again, make sure your setup is done prior to make this process smoother. And then once I do that, I can sort of skip through the next windows. Because it's going to trigger a routing the first time or that you're in it, it might ask you to authenticate through a sign-in because it's going to send emails now to the approver. And now I can see I've got 2 POs that were created for this, 3 requisitions, and out it went. And when I go into the purchase order itself now, I can see that it's always required, it's pending approval, and it's due at this date and time. And then what's nice too is you can see these little chains where in here, this is the commitment function for purchase orders. So if I click on the first line and click on it, I can see that this came or originated from requisition 3. And if I click on the second one, I can see that this came from requisition 2. So 2 requisitions coming into 1 purchase order. So nice transparency. On this side, I think it's the last one we'll look at is the purchase order generator. So again, down here, I've got the PO generator function. Assuming you've set up your inventory with replenishment, so min, max, reorder points, order up to levels, how it's being delivered, and any default vendor information, this function is really good as well. So you can create POs based off a suggestion of that information. So you can come in here, put any filters you like or restrictions, or just click suggest purchase orders, and the system's going to look to all those levels of replenishment and say, hey, you need to purchase these items. And you can say, yes, let's do it, or let's not. And then when you say suggest purchase orders, it's going to create that list of POs. And again, it's going to trigger a purchase order to the proper approver to approve those POs. So when I come back in, those 2 POs I just created, I can now see are here in the list waiting for POs. Or waiting for approval. All right, well, I think that's the time. I want to thank everybody for sitting in and listening to our presentation. Of course, I'll monitor the chat. If it's a live Q&A, I guess we open that up now and go from there. Happy to answer any questions. If you want to contact me later or at any point in time, I've got 2 numbers for one in Winnipeg, one in Vancouver. And then there's my email and website for more information. All right, so I see something in the chat here from Devin. What do you think about the risks of adding workflows for GP clients that are planning on using GP after 2029? I don't know if there's a lot of risks of adding workflows. I think, that's still 5 years away. The setups don't have to be super complex, but I'll read your next piece here. But I think, it's low-hanging fruit, if you will, that you can just start to streamline a few things. You don't have to put the workflow on everything. You can have it set to certain things like accounts or vendors, just to make it a bit easier to control that. Or complex environments that can upgrade, take hot fixes quickly. I think if you're on 18.4 or above, the workflow will work because modern authentication, I think, was required in 18.4. So yeah, if you're on 18.3 or GP 2018 or 16 or 15, this is not going to work for you. You would have to upgrade past 18.4 just to get around the modern authentication rules. So that's probably the limiting factor. I've been discouraging clients of these situations from adding new critical workflows. Yeah, that's fair. again, I think that's just a user experience thing. If there's value setting it up and it's not too complicated to set up, then it might be worth it. But if they're extremely complicated and it's just too much effort, and there's a lot of system glitches, or I've seen it where the environments are complex, where you've got two different domains and you've got a merging of organizations and some people are in one domain and others in another. Yeah, then maybe it might not be the best. But, I think at the end of the day, work with IT. And if there's a simpler solution, then I think it might be worth it. Thank you for your question, Devin. Hopefully that answered some of those points. So Lauren Bishop, just looking at the chat here, is there anything specific users need to do for the live Q&A, or do we just wait and see what happens for the next couple minutes? I think we've got a few minutes left. Yeah, you're welcome, Devin. Thanks for the question. I'm just looking at the other device here. Okay, well, I'll hang on the line until I get cut off or the session closes. But thank you very much for your time here to answer questions, and enjoy the rest of your DynamicsCon virtual conference.